Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to everyone to the Tabadlab Policy Roundtable. Today we're going to be talking obviously about COVID-19 and the coronavirus, but specifically in terms of the impact that the coronavirus has had on the situation in Afghanistan and Afghanistan at large, and by extension on the wider South Asia region, particularly Pakistan. We're delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel of very senior, experienced, thoughtful leaders. I'm delighted to welcome Jawed Luddin, former Deputy Foreign Minister of Afghanistan, currently the chairperson of the Heart of Asia Society, which is an important civil society initiative based in Kabul. I'm also delighted to be joined by Shahzad Akbar. Shahzad is a very prominent leader, women's rights, human rights leader in Afghanistan, and she's currently the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan. And in that position, I think she occupies one of the most critical leadership roles in that very important country. Delighted that you could make time to be with us today. We're joined by Janan Musazai. Janan is the former ambassador of Afghanistan to Pakistan, and perhaps even more importantly, to China. He is a senior fellow at the Heart of Asia Society Foundation. And then, of course, I'm always so privileged to be able to tap into the wisdom, the experience, and the insights of Professor Dr. Barney Rubin, who has worn many hats, including a senior advisor to the US government over many years, and a confidant and friend to many Pakistanis and Afghans who seek to understand the world better. Thank you, Professor Rubin, for making the time. Last and definitely not least, at least not for me, is my dear friend, former colleague, former Foreign Minister of Pakistan, Hina Rabbani Kar. Thank you, Madam Minister, for making time. I know that the timing of this is difficult because many of us are in different parts of the world. But since time is short and your time is valuable, I thought let's send it out to the person sitting the furthest away from all of this. And let's let Barney kick things off by maybe Barney talking a little bit about what your view is of where the peace process is today, as of right now, and how badly or not badly you think it's been impacted by COVID-19.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very great initiative, and I wish we did more of this even when we don't have to. So far, I think we've only begun to see the effects of the pandemic on the region and on the peace process. The peace process is in many respects stalled, which is not unusual for peace processes. In fact, it is more or less the rule rather than the exception, in that there are misunderstandings, lack of trust. Right now, the Taliban feel that the commitments they got from the United States to release their prisoners haven't been carried out. The Afghan government, which is in charge of doing that, feels that it was not consulted and has its own way of doing it. The Taliban are charging that the U.S. has violated the agreement through military operations. The Afghan government and the U.S. are telling the Taliban that its level of violence that it has undertaken is unacceptable, and that the prisoners it has released are mostly not from the Afghan national forces. So far, there is no sign that anyone wants to walk away from it. At this point, the other big obstacle is that the Afghan government is in a state of disarray because of a dispute between two people who both claim to have won the presidential election. Ashraf Ghani, who's recognized by most countries as the president, and Dr. Abdullah. And Russia and Iran have both criticized the United States for recognizing President Ghani. And the United States has made quite an important move by cutting aid by $1 billion. That's 20-25%, at least temporarily, until the Afghans reach a political agreement about. It's really very difficult to envisage the start of the next most important step of the peace process, namely this intra-Afghan talks between the Taliban, the government, and other Afghans, until the Afghan government is consolidated and it's clearer on who will represent all the forces that support the Islamic Republic. So now, at the same time, the progression of the pandemic, I think that, and this is where perhaps my perspective as someone outside the region is important, I think that the biggest effects on Afghanistan will not be the direct effects of the pandemic on Afghanistan, though I believe those will be very serious. I think the bigger effect will be the effects of the pandemic on the United States. I don't know how much people there are aware of that, but we have the highest unemployment we have had in decades. We have an economy that is in many respects crashing. The government has postponed the collection of income taxes, which means its revenue is going down. It has allocated $2 trillion and will allocate probably another trillion for relief, unemployment insurance, trying to move the economy up again. All of this means that when Congress comes back in session, there will be an environment that will be, I would guess, very hostile toward foreign assistance, so that the threat by the United States to cut back aid should not be seen as an exceptional measure. I think it's more likely to be the rule. And I don't know that the government of Afghanistan, which has based its foreign policy on being able to rely on the United States to strengthen it with respect to its neighbors and its opponent, has really taken into account the effects of both the decision to withdraw and the effects of the pandemic on the United States and its economy.
Thanks, Barney. That's really succinct and I think a good point for us to maybe take that to Shahrzad. Talk to us a little bit, if you will, Madam, about the effect of the pandemic on human life, on day-to-day life for the ordinary Afghan. Because a lot of the discourse around Afghanistan is always focused on what the Taliban are doing and what President Ghani is doing and what we want here in Rawalpindi and in Islamabad and what the Americans want out in New York and DC. But what is the effect of this pandemic on the average Afghan citizen? How bad are things today and how much worse are they likely to get? And obviously there's an economic dimension to this, but there are several others too.
Thank you, Mosharraf. Well, there is a lot of concern about what the next few weeks will hold for ordinary Afghans. The economic impact, already you can feel it in the cities where lockdown has been implemented. The country is very poor. There is huge levels of inequality. We have numbers of around 50% of the population suffering from comprehensive poverty. And the lockdown has meant that a lot of daily wage earners are not able to have an income. So there's a real concern of mortality, not only due to COVID, but also issues of hunger and starvation. And it's a serious issue. Government has said that they have made plans to manage the situation, but considering that we don't have a lot of successful examples of very good aid distribution, and it seems like everything is very centralized again, unfortunately. So the local structures are not empowered to deliver the aid, if need be, to people who would be hit hardest. There's a lot of concern about what will most people experience during the lockdown in terms of starvation, hunger, and loss of income. Then there is the issue with the health infrastructure and access to health. There's again inequality there, and there's concern. There are already complaints from Ministry of Public Health, in fact, that the powerful, the strong men are forcing their doctors to prioritize testing their families. So imagine 2-3 weeks into the situation where we have many more sick people, and we have limited number of ventilators, we have limited number of beds, we have limited number of doctors and healthcare workers, and then it will really hit hard, and it will really this inequality will really come to the light, which is another issue for concern. We're also a country that's not rich in terms of healthcare workers. They don't seem to have, we are continuously monitoring the hospitals that are providing services to COVID-19 patients. The doctors and nurses complain about lack of protective gear and equipment, and that's true. And so we have already lost a few of our doctors. So there's also a concern of how will the medical community itself be hit, and what are the long-term consequences of that for the country. There are other vulnerable populations, of course, IDPs, due to both kind of access to income, but also hygiene situations, detainees, which we are closely monitoring. Afghan prisons are overcrowded already. There were decisions made about release, but it's moving very, very slowly, unfortunately, not at a satisfactory pace. Other places of detention, there's a specific issue with shelters, with women who are in shelters. Shelters are not taking any new victims due to the risk of the spread of the virus. So we have new victims of abuse with no place to go, but also women who are being released from prisons whose families are not taking them back. So there are particular, populations that are very, very vulnerable, and we have continuously made recommendations about how to address the needs of these special categories. But we also understand that the way the government is organized in Afghanistan, a lot is centralized. It will vary, the response will vary from province to province. The healthcare infrastructure is very uneven. So we will see how it plays out.
Yeah, it's not a comforting situation in any part of the world. As Barney just talked about, the very scary economic dire straits, the situation in New York, the city that at least I've met Barney in several times, is terrifying. And there's clearly not a critical mass that we've reached either in Afghanistan, or to bring this closer to home here in Pakistan, Madam Hinakar, what is, my own perspective is that we haven't actually reached either critical mass in terms of the numbers of infections or fatalities, but also a critical mass in terms of a wider understanding of what this crisis is. Today, we learned in Pakistan that the Tarawih prayers will go on as planned, obviously with some so-called adjustments. There's supposedly a 3 feet distance that they've agreed to, and the religious leaders are bickering on whether it's 3 feet or 6 feet. And a whole new public discourse has started around that. Meanwhile, as Shahrzad just talked about, there's a massive public health crisis that's potentially brewing in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan. And the backers of Afghanistan, particularly financially, it's very clear, may not be able to not only increase funding in the best case scenario if everybody starts getting along, but actually this penalty that President Trump has imposed may be the beginning of even more financially punitive measures that the US will take. Where will that leave Pakistan in terms of how it is supposed to engage with Afghanistan?
Well, Mosharraf, first of all, thank you for this. And you've sort of asked, first from, I think, the Pakistan perspective, and then going on to Afghanistan. And interestingly, I think the devil in all of this is that those countries which take the decision of locking down and doing the necessary things in terms of social distancing, etc., earlier, will always have, unfortunately, the challenge of ensuring that people still understand the enormity of the task in hand. And once people have been in a lockdown for 4 weeks and feel that nothing happened to them, there is a tendency for policymakers and people to think, this is it, this is over. And we've seen, you have myths like it doesn't affect people in Pakistan and South Asia as much, doing the circles, doing the rounds, right? And I, frankly speaking, have a concern that some of the top figures in Pakistan actually believe in that myth also. So you saw that there was a lockdown, there was quite a strong lockdown, and now that the lockdown is opened, I am fearing that there will be a wave of, unfortunately, cases which will perhaps be overwhelm a dilapidated healthcare system. I mean, it is no secret that our healthcare system is not the most invested in. And I think for Pakistan, it's been an interesting experience, because in Pakistan, we've had this debate, and this is obviously quite interesting vis-a-vis Pakistan also, vis-a-vis Afghanistan also, because just 2 days back in New York Times, there was this article about how in Afghanistan, you need to decentralize by the son of Ahmed Shah Massoud, right? And in Pakistan, there was this whole debate of decentralization and 18th Amendment, giving the provinces too much power, giving them too much money. And here we saw provinces were the ones who were actually taking the lead. And the federal government finally, almost pressurized by the provinces, and not just the province which we are very proud of, saying how it's performed, but also a province in which their own government is there, was forced to take actions which I fear it otherwise would not have. Now, what Barney talked about, and Barney, thank you for that. You were always able to put everything together in a remarkable way vis-a-vis Afghanistan, really. What Barney was talking about is a real threat. Okay, the world as we knew it, I genuinely believe, has changed post-Corona COVID. Okay, the world is not going to be the same. I believe, unfortunately, we were at a really bad part of the international world order, about being able to coordinate, about being able to look at us as a common good, as common people, and move forward. And this will do even worse. So the global world, or the global village that we grew up in, that we were moving towards a global village, now we're moving out of it. And it's a world with big fortresses, and people are reinvesting in the fortresses. Now, what that does is that I believe eventually everybody will be worse off. Okay. And I think the economic challenge that this puts on others, not only is money going to be less, but also the philosophy, or the politics behind giving that money to countries is also going to be much, much less, because people are going to be feeling so threatened. What we saw in New York, what we saw in Italy, these are first world countries, right? And we saw third worldly type of situation over there, with not enough gear for the doctors. This is unimaginable. We have never seen this imagery before. We've never seen impacts like this before. So I think this is going to have a very, very deep impact. And I genuinely believe, as a Pakistani, and also as a I consider myself, this is what my Twitter account also says, I consider myself to be a citizen of this region, right? And I genuinely believe that all of us who believe that bickering and pointing fingers at each other and pointing blame at each other within this region is something which will get us by, and who have believed that others, whether they're in DC or in London or in the Brussels or anywhere else, will come and sort it out for us, and we will use others to put pressure on others. This has to stop. Okay, we have to take responsibility for what is ours. What is ours is what is within our borders. What is not within our borders, it's not ours. And we have to be able to engage in a bilateral fashion. I think it's really important. In some ways, in this really big, messy situation, there's a huge opportunity also, because if, for vis-a-vis Pakistan, Afghanistan, and as someone who has sort of at least I like to believe, invested greatly in this bilateral relations, but also, like everybody else, almost now believe that it's not likely to be able to ever get out of this, fearing each other and holding grudges against each other, and then allowing that to fashion your policy. I believe it's another opportunity, and just to be able to really engage in this. I'm just going to end by saying, and leave you with that thought, that in Munich, just before this crisis started in February, President Ghani was also there, right? And I attended the session where he was there. And I came back thinking from that session specifically that there seemed to be very little ownership from what he said, of the process, or at least not as much ownership of the peace process as was required, right? There seemed to also be a lot of anger on how the Americans had, in their view, perhaps, sort of gone their own way without concerns to their, without giving into their concerns. And it seemed like most of that anger, instead of being able to get, to get out on the US, was actually being diverted to Pakistan and was being blamed. So I think those are things that we need to really, from our side also, we know Pakistan has made many, many mistakes, right? So every country, every policy maker, I think, needs to understand this. In this region, we have learned our lessons from history that we can't let others to solve the problems, right? So some ownership of this would be perhaps one good policy outcome from this crisis?
That's, I think, I mean, thank you for sort of the optimistic, although I think it was tinged with some realism at the end there. But this notion of an opportunity, Javed, I've been, following, your work and your thoughts and your leadership for many years now. I sense, and you please correct me if I'm wrong, but I sense a growing sense of, maybe frustration is too strong a word, but a growing sense of disappointment with the failure of leaders in many countries, but specifically now in Afghanistan, to take advantage of opportunities. And the peace process was one such window or opportunity, perhaps. Hinakar says, COVID-19 might be yet another opportunity, at least bilaterally, for the two countries to figure out how to manage this complex and broken relationship. Do you have any sense of optimism that leaders in your country, in Afghanistan, or elsewhere, including Pakistan, are able to take advantage of this window that maybe this terrible virus, has created?
Well, thank you, Mosharraf. Really, it's a wonderful initiative that you've undertaken, and good to see this some old friends and this discussion. I actually, it's interesting you sort of couched that question because the last word I jotted here on the paper in front of me was opportunity. The word opportunity. It's just that I think it is we are in the middle of this crisis, and I think just too much of our attention does indeed go into basically describing the effects, and certainly at a time when we really don't know a lot about the extent of the challenge that we face in terms of this virus, its implications. Some things are emerging, but we don't really know where this will end. Just this morning, I was, I'm kind of staying within the question in terms of the opportunity, and on the optimism side. Today, I was speaking to someone who sits on the committee on the coronavirus national committee that has been formed by President Ghani, and he chairs it himself. And they were saying that in fact today was, I believe, the 60th day since the first case was reported in Afghanistan, and I believe there's some serious discussion now with help from WHO and other UN and other sort of technical agencies about some analysis that has to be done right now about what does that mean. Is it going to, looking at the trends of this in the last 60 days, what is going to be the possible scenarios that we are looking at in the next 15 days, in the next 30 days, and so on. And apparently, without being, I think the worst thing that these people sitting on that committee can do is to become complacent and then say, well, if in the last 16 days, in the last 60 days, it has more or less, stayed in a limited way, and also the other thing that they were saying was the fact that the mortality rate is much lower than we have seen, and this is again touch wood and thank God that this is much lower than we have seen in developed countries and other areas that have been hit by this. With all that in mind, one thing that is absolutely certain, coming to your question, Mosharraf, is that this has been a total shakedown of everything, whether it's the economy, whether it's the politics. When it comes to Afghanistan, the peace process and the domestic politics that were really at a very, very complex juncture. this has totally shaken everything, and it would be again sort of basically echoing what was said earlier. Madam Carr mentioned this, and Barney said it as well, that that in the post whatever, the world will not be the same after this, and in the one thing that would be important is to see what sort of opportunities that may be there that could be used. I am very disappointed. I think we are within this small group. I can comfortably say it. I probably wouldn't say it. I wouldn't write an article.
Can I just say, Jawed, the intention here is for us to, we are recording and we will publish this on YouTube. So I just thought I'd give that fair warning.
I don't mind you publishing it. Okay, then in that case, but thank you so much for clarifying that. But I can say that I am very disappointed in my country's leadership, not just the guys that we're dealing with right now, but in fact, generally, I think over the past 20 years, we have not seen the kind of transformative leadership that that history, that the countries in historical junctures, and that certainly Afghanistan, faced. The kind of leaders that would step up to the plate and really take the country and take it, transform it. That has not sadly happened, even to the extent that when we are dealing with a very, very changed environment globally, as well as within the region, our energies are still, I think at the national level, sadly, our energies are still massively consumed in what, I don't have to really say it, it's a very informed group, massively consumed by domestic bickering and politics. The only thing I suppose by way of, this, if anything, coronavirus in a kind of roundabout way was an opportunity for the two leaders that were stuck in the post-election dispute. It was an opportunity in the sense that in going back to January and February, there was extreme pressure on these people, on both Dr. Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, about getting this, the election dispute sorted. But I think the corona came right in the middle, and that has kind of eased the pressure on them a little bit. So it bought them time. And I remember also the fact that when back in February, when the agreement between the US was signed, it was really, in the agreement, we had a specific date for the starting of the intra-Afghan element of the negotiations, was to be on the 10th of March or the 11th of March, I believe. And then there was a sense that that was really a kind of a set in stone date, and Afghans had to get whatever the situation, they had to get ready for that. But I think COVID came and somehow changed all those calculations. But those are really, I mean, sadly, those are what is required right now is for our leadership to see that, as was said earlier, that for Afghans to be able to deal not only with coronavirus in its short term or in the long term, the absolutely first step is to get the current political stalemate sorted. I believe that there is a lot of progress. I mean, others may have, maybe Shahrzad may know more about than I do, or Janan certainly is more connected. But my sense is that Dr. Abdullah and Ghani are now engaged in some serious negotiations to come to an agreement that would not only resolve the current political crisis, but also as part of that package to then address the other absolutely urgent matter, which is the issue of the negotiation with the Taliban that's there. I'm expecting that Dr. Abdullah, if he, as is expected right now, if he takes a position in terms of the peace process and then renounces his claim to the electoral victory that he has claimed, then that would be kind of a nice, it's still, I think we've still lost sadly, a lot of very important time, a lot of opportunity, but I would still forgive them as an Afghan citizen. I still forgive these leaders if they get their act right now, and with a very great sense of urgency to start the peace process, which I believe is now being worked out. He is being offered a role instead of a role in the government, a role in the peace process, to head the overall process, the decision-making mechanism. But there will be several other components to it, and I think right now the discussion is about which elements of those other components in the peace process he will be able to control. And plus, of course, there is this element of how much his allies will be able to participate in the government, and to what percentage they will be able to enjoy a share in power. So those are the kind of things happening right now, but will have to be tested.
Sure. Janan, I think, this question of forgiving our leaders, we find it difficult in each country. I know that, and I'll let Barney speak to this in a little while, but I wanted to bring the question of leadership from a more country-based perspective. We've talked a little bit about the potentially substantially lower aid that will come into Afghanistan from the US. We've talked a little bit about the potential improvement in the bilateral relationship with Pakistan. The one thing that everyone is talking about post-corona or post-COVID-19 is China's role in the world, and the potential for the US-China competition to be dramatically scaled up, given especially the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of many countries, including the US, on the origins of the COVID-19 crisis. And there's certainly an element of racism and anti-China sentiment. But within Afghanistan, and in terms of the evolving situation, what are your thoughts about potentially China's increasing role in helping drive forward this momentum for peace that clearly has either been stifled or turbocharged by COVID-19, depending on whether you want to take the extremely pessimistic or optimistic view?
Well, thank you very much, Mosharraf. I agree that this really is a test of leadership, for all of us, but especially in our region. Sadly, I think you referred to the relationship between the United States and China. I think it's quite evident looking at what's happening between those two countries right now. The COVID-19 pandemic sadly will have most likely a negative impact on the trajectory of that relationship. But with regards to China-Afghanistan relations, China has been supportive of the peace process, although it hasn't probably played a role proportionate to the size of its economy, to the fact that it's a next door neighbor of Afghanistan, the strategic close partnership that exists between China and Pakistan. But there certainly is a lot more that China can do, that Afghanistan and Pakistan can do, and I think there are at least 3 areas where that can happen, at least with regards to Afghanistan, Pakistan, but also concerning China's role, is to link, to basically take up once again the project of linking up CPEC with the China Central Asia West Asia Economic Corridor through Afghanistan. And that obviously involves trade, transit trade, the building of infrastructure, energy projects. And there, I think the one thing that's really critical is communication between leadership in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which I'm happy to see is taking place. There was a situation at the Torkham crossing point and also in Spin Boldak, and then that was resolved
quickly
between President Ghani and Chief of Army Staff in Pakistan, General Bajwa, which is something that I think is quite positive, but that has to also trickle down to the level of senior officials in the security sector, in the economic sector. And I think that's probably something that we need urgently, because we can't just focus on the day-to-day management of the COVID-19 pandemic, which really is in many ways like stumbling in the darkness for a way out. And it is really a dark situation. So perhaps it's necessary for officials from Afghanistan and Pakistan to urgently resume dialogue on a mechanism, on a strategy that is agreed between the two countries, which is the Afghanistan-Pakistan Action Plan for Peace and Solidarity. It has 5 areas, covers
I think we might have lost Janan's.
Pakistan, where it's counterterrorism cooperation. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay. So I was just saying that it's really essential for Afghanistan and Pakistan to take up APAPS, the Afghanistan-Pakistan Action Plan for Peace and Solidarity, which covers the whole spectrum of relations and cooperation between the two countries in a really serious and result-oriented fashion. It envisages 5 working groups. It covers cooperation on peace, cooperation on economic development, on trade transit, on counterterrorism, on the repatriation of refugees, Afghan refugees from Pakistan, and also on developing a common narrative between the two countries, both on bilateral relations, but also on regional cooperation between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the good thing on our side and here in Afghanistan is that one of the key architects of APAPS, Hanif Atmar, is now the foreign minister of Afghanistan. So I think this is the right time for the two countries to engage in that really substantive conversation in all these areas, because we can't just look at tomorrow, the next day, the next week. We need to plan for several months in advance and potentially years, because this truly is a new situation. And maybe one of the areas that can be a focus for cooperation is not just trade and transit, trade South Asia through Afghanistan, but also working jointly on ensuring food security in the months and years to come. Because just following up on what Barney and Madam Carr were saying, it's not just that, and what you pointed out, it's not just that foreign aid will dwindle in the years to come, but also economic exchanges and foreign direct investment, for example, will also reduce from outside into our region. So it's really important for us to look at those potentials in the region and link up our traders, our investors, and we need to start that now. And then secondly, I think what the two countries can do and must do is to work on a ceasefire in Afghanistan. I mean, in the years past, when Madam Carr was foreign minister, for example, and Jawed was our deputy foreign minister, the discussion was on getting Pakistan's support to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. They have now concluded a deal with the Americans, not just negotiated with them, but they have a deal with them. They have also sat down officially with the Afghan government, at least on the question of prisoner release from both sides. And now is the time to really join the pressure that's building on the Taliban from the region and also from the international community, the EU and the United Nations, to agree to a ceasefire. And there are 3 reasons for that, not just the coronavirus and not just the deal that the Taliban have with the Americans, but also the fact that the holy month of Ramadan is coming up in just a few days. And so this is a perfect time for the two countries to work in tandem, and also with other countries in the region, Iran, China, as we mentioned earlier, Russia, countries in the Gulf, our Central Asian neighbors, and other countries, to really effect a ceasefire in Afghanistan. And then, yeah, so that I'll leave it there for now, but I think those are at least the few specific things that Afghanistan and Pakistan can do bilaterally, but also in tandem with our other neighbors and key countries in the region.
That's a really good point. We unfortunately won't have Hinakar with us for the entire conversation, so I wanted to take it back to her before we let her go. The idea of opportunity and the idea of what Pakistan and Afghanistan can do together. At least for my money, I don't see that there's been any public discourse around Afghanistan, despite the fact that I do think that this creates an opening and an opportunity. How hopeful are you of Pakistani leadership being able to take advantage of perhaps this window of opportunity? And at the other end of this, for example, on the ceasefire for Ramadan or any other such initiatives, have you heard anything that encourages that would be encouraging in terms of the likelihood of something like that happening?
No, I think, Sheriff, absolutely no, none whatsoever. Simply for the reason that I think currently this is the challenge that Afghanistan has. Currently, every country is consumed with the economic repercussions of what is happening. Every country is consumed by the health repercussions of what is happening. Every country is consumed by the employment numbers that are coming in. As somebody who runs a small business, businesses will find it very difficult to survive all over the world, okay? Because even in countries which don't have the repercussions, the health repercussions, the economic impact is huge, okay? So it was very interesting to listen to Mr. Mustazai, and I'm going to be very undiplomatic over here, and I'm going to say that it's in some ways so discouraging, disheartening, and makes you a permanent pessimist to hear of things which were talked about 7 years, it's been more than 7 years since I was foreign minister, and the language hasn't changed. The talk of opportunity, nomenclature, yes, maybe we're using APAC now, APAC, earlier we were calling it APAC. You can switch the words around, you can switch the letters around, but the core of the problem remains the same. The core of the lack of solution remains the same. Why? Because nothing has changed at the heart of the problem. And I very unoptimistic and very, I see, frankly speaking, no light at the end of the tunnel. When I'm told, for instance, that it was great that Bajwa, the chief of army staff in Pakistan, spoke to President Ghani and something happened. We've gone through years and years and decades of such opportunities. Those opportunities have always been based on one event, a little bit of opening, then us, both countries, ensuring that we shut the door close and we actually lock it up with a very, very big, even a bigger size lock, right? So if we are not able to reboot in our heads, in our minds, and in our policy as to what this is about, it's not going to happen. There's going to be new nomenclature, there's going to be new events, there's going to be new, little bits of opportunities that we see here, there, and everywhere. But now what do I mean by reboot? Let me talk about Pakistan, because I am a Pakistani, right? From Pakistan side, many people in Pakistan who we have been, providing home to the refugees. You see what they're doing in Europe. You see what they're doing in the US, and Pakistan was so large-hearted, etc. And look at the Afghans, almost as if they owe, complete subservience to us. No, they don't. They are sovereign nation, and in that time, if Pakistan made any policy mistakes, that's on Pakistan, not on the Afghans. Right now, every Pakistani needs to treat Afghans as the sovereign equal. Now, for the Afghans, even more importantly, because as somebody who is very Afghan oriented, even I have become very angry, okay? Simply because you go through meetings after meetings where Afghan leaders, starting from Karzai, in President Ghani, use all the influences that it has on Taliban to try and come on the table. And when they do come on the table, the same Afghans turn around and say it's the Pakistans who have enforced these Taliban on us, right? So lack of ownership in Afghanistan and being able to just put, first ask for something, then get it, then put the blame on somebody else. This is not going to work. You're going to lose people who are big time supporters of really strong Afghan-Pakistan ties to also say that, yes, no matter what Pakistan does, you can never get it right. So till the time Afghans take full ownership of their own country. Okay, look at what we saw right now. There was this peace process happening. 3 decades we've been yearning for this, right? And here, Afghanistan, who cannot make peace with each other, and we expect the Afghan leadership to deliver on this. We all talked about Afghan-owned peace process, right? So I think you need to walk the talk. Each one of us has to walk the talk. And I'm at all, I started on an optimistic note, and I'm sorry to be ending on a pessimistic note because a lot of this, the narrative shaping is something which we've seen over years, and these might be lovely words, but until we're able to really change them into action, nothing's going to work. And I genuinely believe till we're able to reboot, but what reboot means is you no more have the option of pointing fingers at each other. I'm talking about the Pakistanis and the Afghans. Till the time we have that option, believe me, it's going to be all the same. And I think each one of us participating here, and practically everybody in the world knows now, there will be no free meals. Everybody and anybody who's not able to manage their country well will suffer greatly. Okay, those of us in the third world countries will suffer even more. The lowest ebb of our population is going to suffer. There's going to be a lot of suffering. Let's try and just be able to at least do whatever we can to improve whatever we can within the country, and of course, hopefully the region.
Thank you. I will take up at a later time the complaint that you've really, I think, set the debate up, and will now leave in a glorious fashion, leave us to pick up the debate and continue it. But thank you for joining us, and I think there's lots here for us to look forward to in terms of continuing the discussion with you and with the friends here. Thank you, Hinakat. Right. So what we're going to do now?
Can I just jump in a little bit?
Absolutely.
So not to respond to what Madam Kar was saying, because I think we all respect her very highly, and she's one of the most prominent politicians in Pakistan who has really been very positive and in many ways very clear-headed about the vital importance of a positive relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And obviously she is still very young, and we hope that she will come back into government and continue to play a very important role in that regard. I just wanted to introduce a very, probably a small nuance, at least with regards to what's happening here in Afghanistan. Yes, there are differences. There are, some serious differences between President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah on the politics, on domestic politics in Afghanistan. And we hope that, as Jawed was pointing out, that those will be resolved, inshallah, in the coming days soon. But there is a very strong consensus in Afghanistan on peace, whether it's among the people who are yearning for peace, who have been yearning for peace for the past 40 years, or whether it's at the level of politicians. I mean, look at the way all political forces in Afghanistan welcomed and supported the peace deal between the Afghan government and Mr. Hekmatyar back in 2016. Look at how all political forces in Afghanistan, despite their internal differences, welcomed the US Taliban deal as a step forward in the peace process in Afghanistan. And then look at how all the political forces in Afghanistan supported the nomination or the announcement of the negotiating team by President Ghani, by the Afghan government. Dr. Abdullah supported it, and all other political forces. So there is a consensus, and I think we should pay attention to what we hear about the Taliban's intentions, which is that now that they have an agreement with the Americans, they have a feeling that they don't need to negotiate with the Afghan government, that they just need to wait long enough for American forces to leave Afghanistan, and then they can just march into Kabul and take over the country, which is a completely dangerous and unrealistic plan, of course. And this is why I think we all need to talk to the Taliban. We all need to send the right signals to the Taliban that the only way forward in Afghanistan is an Afghan political settlement. And the first requirement of that, of course, is for the Taliban to agree to a ceasefire and for the Taliban to agree to direct negotiations with the negotiating team that the government has announced right away.
Well, I think there's no question that there's obviously enormous, maybe fatigue is too negative a word. So we'll go with the word that you use, consensus across all political lines and party lines in Afghanistan. There is a great desire for coherence and peace and an end to the war. But when you mentioned something that made me sort of think again about the really important role that Madam Shahrzad Akbar has moving forward, and not just her, but many thousands or hundreds of thousands of Afghans in terms of the human rights aspect. One of the immediate potential victims of the COVID-19 crisis, because of the massive shift towards the economics, will be on the rights of women, minorities, any group that is vulnerable or poor. And this doesn't just apply to Afghanistan, of course. We are watching this play out in many countries, and at a global level, there's various racist narratives, Islamophobic narratives, anti-China narratives, whether it's Pakistan, where obviously we have these problems. India is a huge example of how, discrimination, separation of different religious identities in hospitals. How difficult is your job already, Shahrzad, given what's already happened, and how much more are you anticipating the shrinking of space for a rights-based narrative or discourse in Afghanistan?
Well, the question around human rights discourse in COVID-19, response to COVID-19, is really not being debated enough right now in Afghanistan. But I think as things unfold, we'll have more and more conversations. Right now, there's a lot of discussion about social and economic rights, and a lot of discussion about how the poor are being really hit the hardest because of the lockdown and the measures around the lockdown. But there are also discussions, we see instances of discrimination because of the fact that many of the first instances of positive cases of COVID-19 were so at least in Herat there were reported instances of discrimination against returnees from Iran and the association between them and COVID-19 in some circles and in some communities. Women, yes, globally, as you said, there are concerns about increased domestic abuse and the fact that victims will have nowhere to go and they're stuck at home with their abusers. We don't have concrete statistics here in Afghanistan, but we have instances, stories, instances, reports of women being impacted more negatively because of COVID-19 and the situations of domestic abuse, because majority of abuse and violence against women, at least according to our reports, happen in Afghanistan. They happen at home. They happen with women at home. In terms of the measures adopted by police during the lockdown, so far it has been, for the most part, very few instances of abuse of authority compared to, for instance, what we hear is happening in India. There are no instances of systematic abuse of power by police due to lockdown measures. So that's an area which, fortunately, so far we have seen moving in the right direction. If there was an instance where the person involved was punished, and the security authorities seem to be very, very conscious of this in a conversation with us and other human rights institutions. But it will, I think, the biggest implications really will be in terms of the poor and people with low income. They will face the most severe consequences. And in terms of the other issue that we're concerned about is the peace process and the implications from a human rights perspective, issues of access to information, transparency, ability to protest and mobilize around rights issues. If the negotiations are happening soon, which we do hope that they do, but we understand that with the COVID-19 situation, there will be less access to the venue of the negotiation. It won't probably happen in the same venue. People will be joining remotely, so the opportunity for media, for civil society to both sides on site will be limited, and then the possibility for victims and rights groups to organize public events to raise your voice about specific agenda items on the negotiation will be severely limited. So we are trying to think creatively about how to ensure, especially the voice of victims in this process, despite the limitations on public movement, on public events and gatherings and conferences and consultations.
I think that's a good segue into what I wanted to ask Barney anyway, which is, Barney, there's been, and you know, we've all followed sort of some of the criticism you take from all sides, but you know, what's particularly interesting is young Afghans who take issue with, you know, your advocacy for a peace process, you know, a long-awaited peace process. Tell me what you think, given both your, you know, educated guess, but also your interactions, particularly in and around Doha. What likelihood do you think, or what is the sense that you get from the current leadership of the Taliban that it is likely to respond to COVID-19 in any kind of way that would assuage some of the concerns around you know, tenderness and gentleness in terms of how the Taliban engages with people who are not like them, women, you know, people who don't share the same sectarian, you know, orientation, and particularly vocal Afghans who have grown up in, you know, the post-2000, 2001 situation, that are much bolder than perhaps their parents used to be. How conscious is the Taliban, and will the COVID-19 crisis help shift the needle on that front in any way, do you think?
Well, first, let me just clarify that I don't have the kind of relationship with the Taliban that I have with my the other Afghan colleagues who are on this screen, many of whom I've known for decades. I've been to their homes and so on. So I have, you know, very limited contact with them, and I can't claim to understand their thought process, just though I do communicate with them from time to time. Look, I think the overall situation now is that the balance of forces is changing primarily because the United States is disengaging. And therefore, the Taliban are becoming, and they already were, you know, becoming more powerful because they were being more successful, frankly, in the political and military side of the conflict. And there is actually, you referred to some of the disputes that I have gotten into with some Afghans on Twitter and so on, but that's a symptom of something much larger. I think it was more important that the National Security Advisor of President Ghani accused the United States chief negotiator of selling out their country, and that they boycotted each other for several months. I think that's indicative of the fact that there's going to be some ugly aspects of relations between the United States and the Afghan government, and those portions of Afghan society that have relied on the United States and the Afghan government, because I don't know whom, if anyone, I should blame for this, but I think the United States made some professions of commitment to Afghanistan that I always knew were not sincere and would not be carried out in the long term. And Afghans who wanted to believe that, believed it and thought that they could rely on the United States. And number one about that, I would say, is the leadership of the country, in particular, the people who are in the leadership of the country today. And I feel they still have not adjusted to the fact, a fact which is even more evident now with the pandemic, that the United States is going to withdraw. And I'm not saying it will stop supporting Afghanistan, but the level of support will not be anything like what it has been in the past. And therefore, the Taliban are feeling not only that they are stronger with respect to the Afghan government, but they're even starting to talk, I hear, to the United States in a different way, saying, look, we can serve your interests in Afghanistan better than the Afghan government because we're cheaper and we're more efficient. Now, as far as the Taliban walking into Kabul, bear in mind that what the Taliban, of course, like any other political organization, they want power. But, taking power in Afghanistan when you're an international outcast is not really worth much. So that's why so much of their international policy has been focused for a long time now on gaining international recognition. So they don't want to take power as pariahs. One of the main reasons that they, in fact, do want a political settlement, though probably not, of course, on the terms that those of us on this call would like, is that in imposing their views, besides the fact that it wouldn't work, and they do recognize they made serious mistakes in the past, it also means they won't get the international assistance that any government of Afghanistan, including the Taliban, wants. Because the difference between the Taliban and global jihadists like the Islamic State and clearer as the negotiations go on, in that the Taliban have ambitions for power in Afghanistan. They are not trying to overthrow the international order in the way that those other revolutionary groups are. They are trying to find a way that they can fit into it without having to give up their own deeply held beliefs. Now, I think it has an impact on regional relations too, because it means that Afghanistan is going to be put in a position where it is going to have to probably it can make more concessions to its neighbors, because it will not have the United States backing it up in the same way. If I could just add one other thing, which it's a different subject, but you were talking about Afghan-Pakistan cooperation, trade. Janan was talking about that, the Belt and Road program, China. The future of Afghanistan as a landlocked country, we've all been saying for years, and that's the idea behind the Heart of Asia Society that Janan and Javed are both active in and have founded, is that the future of Afghanistan depended on connectivity. Now, what is the pandemic about? The pandemic is about distancing, not connectivity. Food prices in Afghanistan have gone up because borders were closed. People are coming, Afghans in both are returning to Afghanistan from both Pakistan and Afghanistan because they are losing their jobs. What is the future of connectivity if we have a pandemic that requires us to distance ourselves?
Well, I think that's a great question. And let me sort of pose that to Javed. But before I do, let me try and give it a slight slant. I think, food security is something that's come up in this conversation. Hina Kar mentioned it. You've just talked about it, Barney. Shahrzad talked about it. We have a serious potential crisis in terms of food that is not entirely about getting food from other places and bringing it here to this part of the world, but more about how robustly logistics and transportation networks are able to operate in a physical distancing world that COVID-19 has created. The to me at least, and again, I'm going to sound as starry-eyed and optimistic as perhaps Janan was earlier, or more, because I would say that the biggest window of opportunity here is the sustainable and sustained supply chain building between not just Pakistan and Afghanistan, but beyond, going back to the question of regional connectivity. I mean, COVID-19 is not going to be the end of trade. COVID-19 is going to be the end of trade in the way that it used to happen before. But that still leaves room, I think plenty of room, for COVID-19 sensitive or COVID-19 guided interactions and connectivity. I don't know if that sounds too optimistic, but I wanted Javed to respond to that. You're talking to people not just in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Javed, but also beyond in the Central Asian countries. Is there any continuing hope that connectivity in the way we thought about it is likely, or is Barney right? Is everything over and we have to build? Not suggesting Barney's saying this, but should we forget about connectivity as the future of our region and our countries?
I think it would be wrong to make conclusions that may be a little premature where we are right now, because as I said earlier, we are at a stage where we don't really know a lot about the full scale of this. The only thing we know is that it will significantly impact the way things are done. Certainly, I think one of the things probably that will be safe to conclude is that the post-coronavirus world will be much more realistic. I think will be much more based on the reality of the world as it is. I don't think it will be. I think it will be much more sort of egalitarian as well, because I think we've seen for the first time that that the Western world, or the so-called first world, as Inarabani Kara mentioned, has been affected in a way that was unthinkable before. We have seen the vulnerabilities of the superpowers. So in essence, I think the reason this crisis was fundamentally different than any other we've seen is that there was always a geographical definition to previous crises. There was in conflict zones where you had in Africa or Asia or the Middle East, where you were expecting poverty, you expected other aspects of need, and then you had the rich world, if you like, the safe world, playing as well as their interest, playing a role in terms of the helping it, with a sense of responsibility. That will be very different, I think, right now. I'm not saying that, again, I think it's probably too soon to judge what, if at all, what aspects of the US as the still remaining superpower, if you like, and the rest of the world, other strategic alliances that exist in the world, what sets of interest will completely change and what interest will still remain, that will have to be seen. I think it's to the extent that that there will be an interest in our part of the world. 22 hours. And there will be, I think it's the one thing that will be affected would be continued economic presence here, and I think that's what then leads to precisely to the point about connectivity. It is a very good point that Bonnie made. In fact, this is something that we have been here, in some of the conversations that John and I have had and with some of our friends here about about the fact that we are in a bit of a fix right now. We have been the whole sort of House of Asia, or the whole regional cooperation agenda has been focused on this point about connectivity. And what do we do now when we can't really now say what we've been promoting it as like the Ten Commandments in Christianity. It's something that's set in stone and cannot change. It's a principle. It's God-given that connectivity is good. But right now we've seen something that's completely countercultural, completely countercurrent. So what do we do about that? I think it has to be seen. I don't have any. But to the extent that, as I said, to the extent that it will be a more realistic world, it's really time that we come up with ideas. I think trade will continue. Trade is, but the difficulty in this part of the world was that partly the reason that that trade and economic prosperity in general across the region was not really up to the full potential, was because human interaction at a different level, not just for the purpose of trade, but for the purpose of just basically connections, confidence, movement of people moving across borders, visa regulations that were among the most complex in the entire world. Freedom of movement was one of the most difficult things in this part, and that was affecting trade and other things. And that will not get better. Certainly, the one opportunity we need to explore is if we can maybe contribute to that by reducing conflict, or limiting at least conflict that's affected the region for a long time. This is certainly one of the things that we have to, and I suggest, Mosharraf, that if we do this, and again, I think it would be very useful to really think about, in Taliban could be a case study here, but we should really look into how this crisis will affect those networks, organized networks that basically perpetrate violence in this part of the region, like basically fueling conflict. How will it affect the Taliban? I mean, we have seen some, again, too early to say, but from the Taliban, we have seen, like, for example, I think the more interesting thing rather than the Taliban was what came from ISIS when they stopped their fighters from operating in certain areas and traveling from one area to another area because of this region. Now, states may find it easier to find alternative ways of doing either trade or meeting over Skype, for example, or over Zoom. But it has to be really analyzed and seen how non-state actors, how these other networks, as I said, in this region that have been very instrumental in terms of perpetrating violence, how will they be affected by the crisis? I just want to, if I may, I know our time is short, but it's sadly, Madam Carr is not here. But one of the things that she said that I wanted to, I would have responded, perhaps more fully if she was here, but. And I fully agree with her that it's quite, and I share her sense of anger that we don't seem to have moved much. I think if we really, the word opportunity, if that's a keyword, then we really have missed so some aspects of it. But in fact, overall, if you look in the last 20 years, if she mentioned past 6-7 years since she was in the government, we've missed a lot of opportunities, and I do that. But I think I think I sensed from her that it was very much, she made it clear that she, that she was disappointed about Afghanistan, and as if we have missed opportunities. And I just would have, if she were here, I would have told her that I think, since I worked in those years when she was in the government very closely with the Pakistani government, if we had, and I think one among the colleagues here, Barney would probably be the one, Janan was there as well, but Barney was very much involved at the time because he was, I think you were advising
Barney was
the,
part of
yes,
he was part of the Scraps team.
yes, Barney was the advisor to the American Special Representative Office, and we were very intensely engaged in a conversation with Pakistan at the time, seeking what we really have got right now. I mean, pretty much the same thing, which was to start some sort of a negotiations. And I'm just thinking, had we, and we deeply believed and still do, and now I think it's been borne out by history basically right now, by facts, that Pakistan could have done all the, what could have delivered what both Afghanistan and Americans were asking of it at the time. And sadly, it was just for whatever reason, it was delayed. We probably would have been much more down the line if we had seen that. Again, I rather, because I think one thing I agree with Madam Carr is the fact that we should move away from blame games and all other things. But because she mentioned it, I thought for the record I should basically set the record straight that she is very much justified as a regional leader, as somebody that's deeply respected in Afghanistan, and by myself. I look up to a senior colleague. But I think it would be fair to also say that there is, both countries would really benefit from introspection and from some sense of self-criticism as well.
I just, again, of course, Madam Kut is perfectly capable of speaking for herself, but the way that I understood what she said, given that I too was at the Foreign Office at that time and was involved in some of those. In fact, the Heart of Asia conference that was hosted that summer, the summer of 2012, which you hosted, Javed and Janan, was yet another instance of what I think Hina was referring to. The meeting between the Prime Minister Ghani of Pakistan and President Karzai that summer. Then the meeting between President Zaidi and David Cameron and President Karzai at Chequers later that year. There was a lot that was happening, and so I'm almost 100% sure that the frustration that she expressed was with the collective failure. And I think she was only echoing your own thoughts, which I also agree with, is that the current scenario was yet another indicator, not of Afghanistan's failure to come together, but the kind of, this is a regional identity problem. This is not on Afghanistan singularly. So I think, but your point is well taken. I wanted to go back a little bit to the question of regional connectivity and maybe come to Janan. Janan, there's a lot of talk now in not just the U.S. or Western countries, but even in Pakistan, the construction sector has been given a boost with some subsidies and some concessions. And the government is working on industry protocols, post-COVID-19 industry protocols. As different countries start to go back to work, India has come out with a massive, the Home Office in New Delhi has come out with a massive set of protocols for public behavior, public engagement, all kinds of, face masks, sanitizers, the whole range of things. given the limitations of the state in Afghanistan in particular, when those ideas start to get discussed, how likely is the system going to be able to abide by those protocols? Because one of the key questions on renewal of trade routes, of trucking, especially the trucking business, which is essential to Afghanistan, it's a lifeline for Afghanistan. One of the things that's going to be a determinant is how quickly the government can establish protocols and how well those protocols can be adhered to. Are you hopeful that that's something that A, already is happening if you're in knowledge, or B, is likely to happen soon?
It is actually happening already. I mean, there's already conversations taking place between officials here in Afghanistan and officials in Turkmenistan, for example, which is very important for Afghanistan in terms of trade and transit trade, but also conversations taking place between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Just 2 days ago, the Commerce Ministry in Pakistan issued a notice allowing for the transit trade, for the movement of wheat, sugar, and one other item, fertilizers, from Gwadar to Chaman and then onwards to Afghanistan. And I think that indicates that it's not just that people are talking about this theoretically, but that things are actually happening. And I think I'm not really a specialist on logistics, but I think it should not be impossible for countries in the region to scale that up. If it's already happening and it's compliant with the safety and health protocols related to COVID-19, then those can just be improved and then scaled up in Afghanistan and between Afghanistan and other countries in the region.
Mosharraf, can I go back to...
Trade has not stopped. Trade has not stopped, and transit trade has not stopped. And it's certainly the volume has come down, but I think can be adjusted and problems can be fixed and scaled back up.
Sure. Barney?
Yeah, I wanted to come back to what Javed said, because I think I disagree with his analysis of the situation, because Pakistan has not brought the Taliban to the negotiating table. In fact, the Taliban have still not come to the negotiating table that the Afghan government and the United States wanted them to come to, which is one where they would sit down with the Afghan government. What happened is that the United States, because it decided to disengage under President Trump, gave in to the demand of the for direct negotiations between the United States and the Taliban. The Taliban came to the table that they had always demanded, the table with the United States, against the will of the Afghan government. And so again, it's because of that decision by the United States that this process has gone the way it has gone. And part of the difficulties is that the Afghan government is in very, genuine difficulties as to how to adjust to the change of orientation of its largest supporter. And I think that some of the leaders of the Afghan government are still have not really accepted the reality of what the United States has decided. I think because it really is a decision to disengage, and it's going to have, it's not going to be sudden, it's not going to be total, but it will have long-reaching effects. It will have ramifications on a lot of policy areas, including on its bilateral relations with Pakistan and the relations with China as well, because the United States has put certain limitations on Afghanistan's connectivity with China because of its opposition to the Belt and Road program. That might change as well.
So, Barney, I think what you've done there is opened up the terms of reference for our next conversation, rather than one in which we'll go back to Javed on this occasion. I wanted to give the last word, I think, to Shahrzad, if that's okay with everyone else. Shahrzad, I kind of asked this in a roundabout way, but I'll ask it more explicitly. are you at all hopeful that this version of the Taliban, the 2020, 2021 version of the Taliban, is going to return to Afghanistan with any kind of, in terms of engaging in public life and normalcy, with any kind of renewed focus on protecting the weak and the vulnerable, especially the weakest and the vulnerable in Afghanistan? Or do you think that whatever, as maybe Barney said, and perhaps I'm adding a little bit of cynicism to it, or do you think that a lot of their open-mindedness or their willingness to engage on these topics is really about international acceptance and not about any fundamental change in the demographic makeup or the ideological commitment of the Taliban?
I think it's early to judge Taliban positively on their change from what we see on the ground. I mean, right now, violence is killing more Afghans than COVID-19. There has been repeated calls for ceasefire by Afghans and internationally and by UN. And I was expecting that, perhaps wrongly, like many Afghans, that some form of reduction in violence would continue, even if not officially agreed to after the US-Taliban agreement, for the sake of putting at least the lives of Afghan civilians first. Just an indication by Taliban that they care about the lives of Afghans and mainly Afghan civilians. We continuously record civilian casualties in the commission. All sides are involved in causing civilian casualties. In the past 2 weeks, we have had high numbers of civilian casualties continuously being caused by Taliban. So I think we also look at the situation on the ground in areas under Taliban influence. I must say that the kind of attitude is slightly different in different parts of the country by different Taliban commanders. So there's an individual and perhaps regional aspect to it. But overall, stonings of women do happen. Extreme horrific forms of violence against women do happen in areas under Taliban influence. These forms of violence also happen in areas controlled by the government, but they are not systematic in the way that they are endorsed by authorities, in the way that they happen in areas under Taliban influence. So I think there's still a lot that Taliban have to prove to Afghans about respecting the lives and dignities of all Afghans, regardless of their religious background, their gender, and I think there's a lot that needs to be seen on that front, unfortunately.
Can I just add something to that, Mosharraf? I think we focus too much on whether Taliban have changed. We don't know whether they've changed or not. But what we do know is that other Afghans have changed, and that the other Afghans are not as weak and vulnerable as they were in the past. They're much more educated. They have a lot more resources. So I think let's not forget, Taliban's behavior will change, not just or maybe primarily because of of how they've changed, but because the rest of Afghanistan will change, and that's a reality that they will have to adjust to.
I think that is a fantastic note for us to close this conversation on. Afghanistan has changed, I think, more than perhaps even Afghans realize. As somebody from the outside, even between the first time that I went there in 2007 and today, there's such a dramatic shift in mostly in positive ways. So I'm looking forward to continued change in Afghanistan, continued change in Pakistan, continued change in the United States. That lends greater, I think you said it beautifully, Shahrzad, that lends greater human dignity to the experience of living for people who weren't born with a silver or golden or titanium spoon in their mouths. So with that prayer for the people of Afghanistan, for the people of Pakistan, and for the people of the United States, and really everywhere, especially those suffering from COVID, I thank all four of you, and Madam Hinakar, Madam Shahrzad Akbar, Honorable Mr. Javed Ludin, Honorable Mr. Janan Musazai, and Honorable Professor Dr. Barnett Rubin. You guys have been a fantastic group of friends over the years, and I hope we get to continue to have these kinds of conversations, inshallah. Thanks for joining us.